This kind of work is part of the top-down approach towards nanotechnology. The idea is we can build fairly large things, things that are on the scale of microns, and we can then move down to ever smaller scales using that as a starting point. Then there's the bottom-up approach. That's the approach of taking the atoms and molecules and building larger and larger complex structures using scanning probe microscopes. This is the state of the art today. This is a scanning probe microscope. And the basic idea is very simple. You take a sharp probe, that's where the probe part comes in the scanning probe microscope, and that sharp pointy probe pokes at a surface, and you scan the probe over the surface, and if the probe is really sharp, then the atom at the tip of the probe can then image the surface, and you can actually see the individual atoms. We can image things like buckyballs on a silicon surface, and a buckyball, by molecular standards, is a fairly big molecule. It has 60 atoms in it. We're just able at this point to move those buckyballs on the surface, and we can image those buckyballs on the surface and see where they are and what's going on. We expect that this kind of equipment will gradually become more capable in terms of its ability to manipulate molecules and atoms on surfaces and to arrange those atoms and molecules into more complex structures. We're just starting out. It's always easier to look at what is possible, theoretically, than to realize it in practice. Flight to the moon. Well, if you look back at the history of rocketry, you find one of the major problems is that many people thought it couldn't be done. There was a very famous editorial in the 1920s, New York Times Magazine. It's impossible to go to the moon because there's no air to push against in space. Rockets won't work. We can laugh today. But that was a serious concern back then. That was a serious misunderstanding. And we have equally serious misunderstandings about nanotechnology today. And at some point, sometime there will be an effort to build molecular manufacturing systems. We don't have a major program, a national level program, a multi-billion-dollar program to develop molecular manufacturing. But we will at some point. My dad taught physics back at Berkeley, and in the 50s, he went to the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, as it was known back then, and he ran Project Pluto. Now, you'll have to remember back in the 50s, we were still working out how it was you deliver nuclear weapons. People were still thinking, well, maybe what we should have is a nuclear-powered airplane that would simply fly around continuously. So one of the ideas was a nuclear-powered ramjet. And my father ran the project to develop the nuclear reactor for the nuclear-powered ramjet for the nuclear-powered airplane. Once the nuclear reactor had been developed, however, Congress decided to cancel the program, and I think for rather obvious reasons. Having an airplane with a nuclear reactor on board didn't look like the best thing to be testing in the area, and the project was quietly shelved. If you look at it and say, should we have developed that nuclear capability, that nuclear ramjet, I think in retrospect we can say, well, the idea of an airplane flying around with nuclear power on board doesn't look like a sensible one. We did make the correct decision we did decide not to deploy that particular technology. But as we look at new technologies, we don't know exactly what they are. Right now, there's still a debate about whether molecular machines are possible or not. We cannot regulate a technology. We cannot decide on whether to deploy a technology or not to deploy a technology if we don't understand what it is. There's an idea floating around that perhaps technologies are so unthinkable we should back away from the basic research. We should back away from understanding the technologies. I think that's a mistake. We need to understand what technology can do. We need to understand that both so we can make intelligent decisions, but also so that we can understand what other people, what others might do to us. New technologies have always brought new capabilities, new benefits, and new potential for harm. Take fire. We learn to benefit from that technology. We can cook our food. And we learn to deal with the problems that that technology could create. We have fire departments. This new technology could pose new problems. We need to understand those. We need to respond to those. We need to develop the equivalent of the fire department. We need to think about how do we deal with those problems? How do we deal with the issues? If we have a box that makes things, what should it make? We might decide there are things we don't want to manufacture. Weapons, for example, maybe you don't want to be able to push item number 437 and have some very nasty little weapon come out. Maybe that should be restricted. At the end of the day, we are all responsible for making the decisions that affect our future. And we collectively have to make the decisions about how to deal with new technologies. Believe me, no one wants to go back to the caves. No one is going to say, I'm going to renounce modern technology. Anyone with any sense is going to say, no, I don't want to give away all of these benefits and go back to the cave. So we're not going to walk away from technology. But we knew